Pay attention. This is all the things we've been talking about. Thank you.
I don't know how to use this thing. Can I turn this on?
It's a bad sign.
Yeah, right. I'm supposed to know stuff about technology, I guess, but PowerPoints are not my strong suit. And speaking of which, I am kind of going to be modifying this a little bit on the fly, and I'm basically going to add in the section at the beginning. So like I mentioned, folks, earlier, I'm going to sort of start out by talking about the van and about this stuff at sort of the 40,000 foot level, right? Like a high level overview of like what the van is, why it's important, some important things to keep in mind about the van. And then I'm going to drop down to like the 10,000 foot level and talk about, okay, like here are, practically speaking, some of the sort of things we actually use the van for and like the workflows you might use. We're not going to go back into the weeds and like open up the van again and literally do the clicks because we've got lots. I'm going to point you towards lots of great help resources. You're always welcome to call me. We've got a whole schedule of webinars and in-person trainings over the next couple months, and there'll be more of those obviously after the primary election. So some of those are specifically focused on that more in the weeds piece of like, okay, here's the actual clicks you need to do. Okay, so it wasn't just me. There's like something wrong with this thing, huh?
Yeah, it's not working. Change the batteries.
Well,
I will be your forwarder.
Yeah, so like it says, my name is Josh Lotto, for any of you who missed me, and I guess Brad was saying, I know there are some new folks in the room who I think have not introduced themselves yet. Anyone? Do you want to go back around completely maybe for everyone's benefit, or? I don't think you've introduced yourself. I don't think you said you're a county clerk.
Hi, Bill Burgess, Marion County Clerk. I think all the candidates from Marion County here know me because they get to come to my office. Been Marion County Clerk for 14 years, and it's a very exciting, rewarding work trying to make democracy work for everybody.
And I think maybe you two are the only ones who hadn't.
She's helping me with the van stuff, Playing Terrace GIS.
Great. Awesome. Well, welcome. Great. So yeah, and just I guess to give you just like a little bit of context, I've been working in sort of political data for a while now, mostly with labor unions actually before this. So I sort of started with the AFL-CIO. I worked for the major national voter file provider for labor unions, which is called Catalyst in DC. So I've sort of seen the stuff from like a lot of different angles, gives me kind of different perspectives, but at the end of the day, like you guys have an even more important perspective is the folks actually on the ground. But yeah, so before we dive into the actual PowerPoint, I just wanted to start out by talking, and I did sort of mention this earlier, but also for the benefit of the folks who aren't here. So like, what is the van, right? You'll often hear it referred to also as a vote builder. Vote builder refers specifically to the Democratic Party's sort of copy of the van. VAN is really a more general term. It stands for Voter Activation Network. To put it very simply, it is a tool for accessing the voter file, right? And what is the voter file? I'm maybe going to talk in a little more detail about what the voter file is, but to put it very simply, it begins with the big old list of every registered voter in the state that is compiled from folks like Bill up to the Secretary of State's office, and then someone like me acquires it. And then that data is augmented, and there's all sorts of work and processing that goes into it on top of it, but that is the voter file. And at the end of the day, the My Voters part of the van, the direct contact part of the van, that is sort of simply put what it is, right? It's a tool for accessing the voter file and also for making use of that data. So it not only helps us like plan for and understand our district and then execute common campaign tasks, it also, even more importantly, lets us enter our results and track the results of that outreach, which helps both make our campaign smarter, right, but also like makes all of us collectively smarter because we're sort of slowly building this resource. Which gets to the other main thing that I want to talk about before we dive in, which is sort of what I call like rules to live by for the van. And the first and most important rule is that the van is an incredibly valuable community resource that has been built by years of Democratic candidates. And part of the deal, and it even explicitly will say this in your van contract, like we talked about earlier, if you were using the van, it is your obligation to contribute back to this community resource, right? It has only become such a useful tool because everyone has been using it. Everyone takes seriously contributing to it. And you know, along with that is everyone gets access to the van in a lot of different ways. it is an incredibly complex, expensive tool, right? Like the van costs hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, like when you incorporate the data and the software itself. So the only way we can all have this is because everyone contributes what they are able to, right? And so that's why like different candidates pay different amounts for the van, but at the end of the day, it is important that everyone contribute what they're able to, because that is the only way we're able to have this amazing resource. So yeah, that is sort of the first rule, is that it is a shared community resource, and you know, we live our values as Democrats. We care about building our community, and that is something to bear in mind. So along with that, it kind of goes with that, sort of a classic field joke. If a door knock happens in the field and it is not, and the data does not end up back in the van, it's not a sort of like question of if it happened. It did not happen, right? You must record the results of your data back into the van, both because it is required in your contract and it helps make the voter file and everything better, but also because it is what is best for you and will allow your campaign to understand the results of what you're doing and make use of it as well as possible going forward.
Quick question, is this the same thing that we use for the NLP program?
Not exactly. The source of the data is, and the NLP program works. NLP services sort of fits together and works with the van, but it is almost, you could think of it as a separate, more specific layer on top of the van that our good friend Steve Packer built for us. But yeah, in some ways the van is like more complicated, right? Like that's the kind of idea of NLP services, is it's like does exactly what it is intended to do and nothing more. And frankly, that wouldn't meet the needs of most of you folks, because you need to be more nimble, you're doing more things, you're having more rounds of contact and all this stuff. Okay, so make sure you get your data back in, and sort of like a corollary of that is please, please, please do not ever put fake data into the van. And as candidates, you know, like I know that is like not something any of you would ever do, but it is something to be aware of for your staff, and especially if you are hiring more staff and paid canvassers and this kind of thing. You know, fraud is something that happens. There are ways in the van to keep an eye out for it. And you know, in most campaigns that I've been involved with, like if somebody is actually deliberately falsifying data in the van, like you should probably fire that person, right? Like that is a very serious, and in fact would be a material breach of your van contract. So I certainly don't want to discourage you from experimenting and playing around and putting in fake data for the purposes of like, oh wait, how does this work? Just please make sure you clean up after yourself when you do that. And if you need help doing that, give me a call and I'll help figure out how to get whatever you did cleaned up. And my last sort of rule of the van is that when you are deciding how to track and code your results and how you are sort of like thinking of encoding your data, that you always want to be like driven by simplicity and consistency, right? Like you want to be as absolutely simple as you can possibly be, but not too simple, right? So like you need to make sure that you have what I would refer to as the level of granularity that you need, right? So you want to start out collecting as fine a data as you need, not more fine than you need. But so for example, like a really simple example is first and last name. If you have a form that's collecting people's names, I would always recommend you collect first and last names separately at a more granular level than their whole name, because we can always roll up, right? We can combine the names, but it is not necessarily easy and sometimes completely impossible to go the other way, right? So when you're thinking about simple, you want to make sure you start with the level of granularity that you need, but again, no more. So like simplicity and granularity, like they are in conflict, and it's just all about like finding that right middle ground, and then along with that, consistency. Making sure that, you know, it's like the boring stuff, right? It's like training and making sure that everyone on your campaign thinks of refused the same way, thinks of how you're coding the data consistently, because that means you can have faith in your data and know what it means, and you know, with a high degree of confidence. Okay, let's get going. I'll talk later about getting help in the van. Oh, this is working.
Yep.
So yeah, so we sort of talked about this section. What is Vote Builder? It's not literally a van. It does stand for Voter Activation Network. It is made by a company called NGP Van, which many of you might have heard of NGP. It is their other main piece of software. It's more geared towards digital and campaign contribution tracking and that kind of thing. It's very commonly used as well. And one upside is that it can talk to the van in certain limited respects. So yeah, NGP Van you'll often hear it referred to that way, but really that's the name of the company. So just to give you an idea, this is our sort of hokey enhanced running man, right? So like I mentioned, the data starts with the Secretary of State's office, and that includes things like, one of the most important things that includes is vote history, right? And we certainly get really key and important information from the voter file itself, but then we add things like phone numbers. Our DNC and our vendors at the national level do things like improving the address data and just bringing in all this other stuff. Like one of the things that at the state level we do is process and correct the local districts as well as we can, so that for folks like you guys in local races, that you are able to more easily select your districts. And sort of most importantly, and as we talked about earlier, some of you guys missed it, but we went into the sort of create a list tool, which is the main tool in the van that allows us to cut down to a subsection of what is available in the van. So this is kind of this long section and I think this is what has been done in the past, talking in a little more detail about this process of how the data sort of gets from the county clerks all the way eventually to us. It is sort of like a long, slow thing. So, the Oregon SOS, they produce a file like once a month. That is like as frequent, even if we wanted to get the data as absolutely frequently as we wanted to, at the state level, that's as frequently as they will sell it to us. We do more like once a quarter, although it varies, and we like try and time this as well as is possible for all our various users and different needs and stuff. But generally speaking, Vote Builder is fairly up to date. So like I used to administer our Oregon's van, the America Votes van on the other side. It's like, it costs much more money for them. It's much harder for them to update the file. So it is updated less frequently generally than it is for us. Because of the great support of the DNC, basically, we're able to do it more frequently. So yeah, like I said, it starts with Secretary of State. That is when and then I go and acquire it from them. Like I said, they make it available once a month. We purchase it. We do various checks and error corrections, most importantly, processing and standardizing local districts, adding in some additional data sometimes. It gets to the DNC. The DNC does a whole lot of additional processing and standardizing, adding in geocodes. You mentioned GIS, right? So geocodes are obviously vitally important if you want to do things like cutting turf. That is how the van knows how to put a dot on the map for someone. So they use various external vendors to add in all sorts of different commercial data, phone numbers, all this stuff. One interesting thing to note is that, Brad mentioned the idea of like knowing someone's subscription, that they subscribe to a magazine. The reality is we don't actually know that at our level, right? All that commercial data that gets purchased, it's actually not made available to us. It's like hundreds and hundreds of data points. We don't want to like sort through all that stuff, and like I don't know what any of us at this level would do solely based on that, right? And so what happens is that those commercial data points are used in the modeling that the DNC or other vendors build for us, and they inform those models, but those models tell us the things we like actually care about, so we don't have to be like, does somebody who like really likes Scotch, does that mean they're more likely to be a Democrat? Who knows?
Hence the progressive points. That's an abstraction.
Yeah,
it's an aggregate metric.
Exactly, and progressive points are a great example of like what I was sort of calling like a roll-up. So progressive points are almost like they are not used as much anymore, and it is something that was really more useful before we had these statistical models. And so what progressive points are is a way for all the campaigns, like when we're all out there collecting candidate ID responses, it is a way to roll up the results of that data. So like if some campaign somewhere talked to you and you said, yeah, I support the Democrat, you would get a certain number of progressive points. If you said you're undecided, you get a certain number of waffler points. If you said you were supporting the conservative, you get a certain number of conservative points. And so even though like your campaign can't see the candidate ID response of Say's campaign, those points could theoretically still inform your campaign if you wanted to say remove people who are super conservative. And the reason that the statistical models are so much better is because no matter what, we can't talk to everyone in the state, right? Like our coverage of progressive points is quite low, and that's why I tend to recommend that folks use it for removing people from your list rather than trying to like use it as your base list, if that makes sense. And like that, at the end of the day, our statistical models are not always based on like actually talking to that person. They're not always correct, like right, they're statistical guesses, but we have nearly complete coverage, right? For almost everyone, we have that piece of information. So yeah, we add lots of phones. Getting as good a phone numbers as possible on the file is like an enormous and ongoing challenge. You will certainly notice that there are many people we don't have numbers for. There are many wrong numbers. There are many disconnected numbers. The DNC does the best job they can for us. more and more, certainly my focus is how can we get as many cell phone numbers on there as possible. Yep. Continue. They do all sorts of stuff for us. USPS national change of address data, so NCOA certified, which means that we can get discounted mail rates when you're using that data. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to get like too bogged down in this, but they do a lot of things for us before it even gets to eventually to the van, right? And the DNC hands the data off to the van and they actually load it up. So that is another good thing to know. Like NGB Van, they are not a data company in the slightest, right? They are a software company.
What's sonar? You said sonar for the phone, the last one there. Does the sonar phone thing?
Sonar
Sonar
model.
Yeah, so I should have removed that one. I'm not actually totally sure exactly what my predecessor was referring to. I mean, we do have like phone quality models of various kinds. It's a complicated issue making use of those models because not surprisingly, they are not at the individual level, they are at the phone level. So if you're really interested in using that, let me know, but it always depends, like whether you want to do that, like what you're trying to do, right? Like often you might just be wanting to use every phone number you have because even if it's not a great number, maybe there's some chance you're just trying to get to that contact goal that Brad's talking about. Like, so you might not care that the number's bad, but depending on your resource limitations or something, you might care quite a bit. So let me know if you're interested in those.
I would, just as a guess, there's a lot of tactics you can use, attempting to SMS, and a soft failure, reject from the gateway will tell you a lot about that phone number. So if I were to guess, I'd say sonar modeling is like soft attempts, not a full attempt to call someone or to SMS them, but really just to get a technological response from the servers that handle that. And it will tell you a lot with soft errors.
Right, and there are lots of different vendors and stuff that do various things like this, and it's always, at the end of the day, like someone, here in Oregon, like we don't really have the time or the focus to be like particularly focused on that, and that's why it's like so great that the DNC does it for us. I think it's expensive, and I think at the end of the day, like a lot of those services are not cheap enough yet and effective enough yet to be worth it, right? Because like if we pay a bunch of money to like flag our phone numbers and then it's not that accurate anyways.
Ironically, it's starting to get cheap enough for small campaigns.
We're getting there. It's definitely something you can look into. Like Pew does a lot of research on this kind of thing because they are really care about doing high quality survey research. So if you're really interested in phones and phone quality, that is a good place to do some reading. Okay. So yeah, they hand the data off to NGP, who produces the nice system for us where we use the data, but they are not really involved in the actual producing of the data, and that is like where it ends up with us. Yeah, so this kind of touches on like what I said. I mean, and I certainly emphasize that, like we're talking about with phone numbers, we are doing, and all our vendors are doing the best they can to do this incredibly complex process for us, but it is never perfect. We are all constantly improving it by loading your results back in. And so again, I would just emphasize, it is extremely important that you put the results of your work back in the van, both for your own campaign and for all of us. So these are kind of like the three pillars of traditional direct voter contact, which is like what we most typically associate with the van. And the van does directly facilitate all of these, essentially, right? We can do exports, although you can actually, people back in the day literally printed labels from the van. These days, that's not so much of a used feature. Usually folks are running an export of your mail list and either sending it to a vendor or using just external mail merge tools. And then within the van, both within the van and with printed sheets, like we were talking about earlier, there are tools that facilitate calls and canvassing. And so like on the door-to-door communication front, it's allowing us to build and target canvas lists, cut turf. It has a really nice turf cut, easy to use turf cutting tool built into it. It has facilities for managing your turfs once you've created them, and then either creating printed walk sheets or using Minivan, which is the smartphone app, which allows you to just send a list to a user. Like I was saying earlier, I really encourage folks to use Minivan. One of the coolest things that they've done with Minivan lately is that it used to be that if you wanted to canvass with Minivan, you would have had the campaign manager or whatever would have to create a user account for every person who was like actually using it. And so that's why big campaigns would typically, and like this is what the Measure 101 campaign still did, is have a bunch of like generic volunteer accounts that folks log into. But now Van has it so that anybody no matter who you are, you can just download Minivan. You can create your own sort of Action ID account. It doesn't actually let them have access to your system. It is just like their own personal login to use Minivan for. And then as soon as they've done that and created the Action ID and logged in, they can download a list. And that's like all they need to do. You know, folks still forget their passwords and stuff. It can still, you're never gonna get completely away from that kind of struggle, but
It
it's,
allows them to hopefully store information, send information back as well.
yes, yeah, so
It's
many,
not just a read-only.
right, no, not at all. Minivan, I encourage you to explore, like it's sophisticated at this point, you can even have like branching scripts in Minivan that like change based on their responses and stuff. But no, so the way Minivan works is you like download the list. It does not need to be talking to the central system all the time, which is really nice because you can put your phone on airplane only mode to conserve battery. But then at the end of the day, when you're done, you sync your data, and then your field director or whatever has the opportunity to actually review the data, even to the extent of checking your timestamps to make sure someone's not sitting in Starbucks recording a bunch of results. And then once they are satisfied that the data is accurate, then they can commit it to the system.
That saves you a ton of time on the back end.
Right.
Because you're not having people handing you a stack of results to enter in.
And
And-
fewer errors too.
And oh yeah, I mean there are so many reasons
Yeah.
to avoid data entry and to use Minivan if at all possible. And if you think you can get your folks to do it, you know, there's obviously can be that sort of technological challenge. And I will say that Van has great functionality to prepare very customizable printed call and walk sheets, and has a whole lot of different pretty great ways for helping facilitate data entry back in, particularly like barcode scanning. So like if you're having to do a lot of that, let me know and I'll help you get going with barcode scanning or a good other way of getting the data in. But I would still just like anything you can do to not use paper lists, strongly recommend it. So phone calls, like I sort of referenced them earlier, but we have this functionality called Virtual Phone Bank that just presents the person that they're calling and information about them and where they can enter it on their computer screen. And you know, I would really, you know, I understand where you're coming from about like older folks not liking that, but I hear stories all the time about older folks who are, someone's like, okay, we're gonna like let you try this, and they actually really like it. It is almost like they don't even, you can literally, I mean, if you have the computers and like the logistics to make this happen, it's like you can sit them down in front of the computer, open up the browser for them and like get them there.
Do you guys have
And
training
do it.
materials for the phone call stuff so just you don't have to go through and train everyone individually?
You mean on like actually using, you know,
So if I were to have like a whole bunch of people like want to do phone banking, virtual phone banking, do you guys have something
we
that's
Touch
don't-
on that in the volunteer section of this.
Yeah, there are materials that touch on that. I mean, the reality is that a lot of the most important training, this gets back to like the data coding that I was talking about earlier and simplicity and consistency. It's like a lot of the training that you actually have to do of those people isn't so much about using the van, it's about making sure that they are recording the results in exactly the way that you think they are. And like really, it's like, yeah, that you need some training to set up a virtual phone bank and get it going. Actually using it is like, if you have any level of familiarity with computers, is extremely straightforward. It's just sort of all right there for you, drop downs to enter the information. So, and the cool thing about Virtual Phone Bank is we do have this open VPB that is basically the equivalent of what I was telling you about Minivan, which allows folks to use your virtual phone bank without having their own account. So again, they just need to create an Action ID, and then you just send them the link and a code, and then they can be at home making calls. So like we talked about in some detail earlier, you know, we have this interface called Create a List for build that can build incredibly as complex the queries as you could possibly need. We can save them either as saved steps or as a fixed list. Counts and crosstabs is basically the very limited sort of data analysis functionality that comes with Van. It is actually quite, you know, you can get a lot of what you need. I'm going to be teaching a training before the primary called like district analysis and planning that is going to really touch on like how to use counts and crosstabs to like in more detail do some of the stuff that Brad and I were talking about earlier. Certainly good to know that it exists, just lets you generate basically basic counts and summaries. So yeah, we basically already did this, right? So we talked about models, and we actually did go in and look at this is how you literally select model cutoffs. And like I mentioned, the one other really good thing to know, like this is great if you're like building your universe and you're like, okay, we want to use these cutoffs to like get to our big general universe. But a lot of times you end up in a place where like, okay, we said like this is our big voter contact universe. now we only have X dollars or X time to actually do this, so we need to reduce it down to a more manageable size. And so create a list has a specific functionality to say, okay, I have like a 20,000 person list, give me the score cutoff, right? So you could play around and find the cutoff that gave you exactly however many people you were looking for, but it would take a while, right? And you'd have to like go back and forth. But so what it lets you do is just say, okay, I want the 5,000 of these people with the highest dem support score, or the lowest, or the highest likelihood to vote, or any of the different scores we have available. Yeah, so that is querying on scores. Yeah, basically I already talked about all this stuff. Turf cutting, walk and call reports, that's what you use to generate the physical call sheets and walk sheets. Minivan, VPB. Okay, so getting help with the van. First of all, the most important thing that I would emphasize to you is that Van is a really sprawling piece of software that does a lot of different things and sort of tries to be everything to everyone. And that, in many ways, can make it seem complicated and intimidating. And the reality is that it is complicated in terms of breadth, but doing any given thing is actually usually not that hard. And I would just always encourage folks to feel empowered to just dive in and try stuff out and play around with the system and click on most of the buttons you see, as long as they don't say delete everything. And you know, that is the only way that you can really learn how to use the van. Like, no matter how many of these trainings you come and do with me, like, you're not going to really gain that comfort until you just feel empowered to just try stuff out. And so what I always encourage folks to do is spend 20 or 30 minutes really just diving in and trying, and then spend another 20 or 30 minutes using some of these resources, right? So like we have a somewhat outdated, working on updating it, training repository that you can log in here on our website. It has a bunch of videos and stuff like that of past trainings like this. So that's a good place to look. The Van help docs is the sort of next best set of generic how-to documents. And the way you get to that is in the top right corner of the Van by your name. You just click, it'll open up a drop down and it'll say Van help docs. And that'll take you to the sort of whole Van help docs portal. Has a lot of good stuff there. The DNC did this year finally put together a good, succinct, what we very nerdily call the Vanual, right? And it basically, the idea of it is like one document that contains the most important things you need to do. If I set up a committee for you anytime in the last like 2 months or so, I almost certainly emailed this to you when I set it up. So that's like another good, great place to look first. Most of you probably heard about the schedule of in-person and webinar trainings that we're doing. If you haven't been on that email list, let me know and I'll make sure that you get that. So that's great. And the last thing I'll just say about this is I want folks to dig into the resources themselves. I want folks to try things out for themselves, but also don't beat your head against a wall, right? So like if you spend half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour trying to figure out how to do something, looking through these help docs, don't spend another 4 hours. You know, just call me and we'll figure it out. And it might be that I can tell you like some 1 minute solution and we'll get it done really quickly. That won't always be the case, but sort of the point is like sometimes I get folks who come to me and it's like, I was trying all week to like do this thing, and it's like don't do that. There's no need for you to do that. Like I am here to help and happy to help. So yeah. And with that, this is my contact information. Yeah. Any questions?
Are you supposed to? Because I used to sign up for a couple of those in person and the webinars.
Yeah, you'll be getting notification emails in the lead up. Yeah. About like the specific ones, like a couple days before each one. Whoever's running the training will email out the info for like actually getting there or attending the webinar. Yeah.
So we signed up for trainings and Future Pack made an in-kind donation for our access, but we haven't received any notification.
And so what's the name of your candidate?
That's Jared.
Oh, and we did set you up with a committee, didn't we? Have we not?
I haven't received any.
I think you maybe did. Touch base with me.
I haven't got an email yet.
By email. So the way it usually works for FutureBack or for SDLF is like you guys will, we have a subcontract with both of them, and that's why the like in-kind donation comes from them instead of the DPO. And so, when you're like, oh, I'm a Democratic House candidate or whatever, you go talk to FuturePack.
Right.
She says, okay, Josh, set up their committee for him, and then I get you going.
We saw that happen. But
Okay, yeah, so you do have access, or I just have not reached out and said your committee is set up? Okay, yeah, if it was recently, that is because of the platform convention and stuff, so I am a little behind on that.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I will get you going as soon as I can. Early next week, hopefully, is what I was telling Ms. Cryer. Yeah.
Hey Josh, I know that you're not going down into the weeds on this one, and this is a pretty weeds question.
That's good.
What are the different ways that you can parse the information that you have access to in the van geographically?
Yeah, there's not very much functionality to do that, unfortunately, right? So I actually just got this question in a training I did for FuturePack. We were like literally doing turf cutting, and he was wondering, somebody asked, like, oh, well, can I see how can I see the other information, like, while I'm doing this? And unfortunately, like, it's just not a powerful GIS tool.
But there are workarounds. You can cut lists by.
You can.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
You can cut lists.
You can cut lists by precinct. You can.
And so,
Yeah, you can create a map region where you're cutting your turf. It's just a single precinct.
and this kind of,
Okay.
Right.
yeah, and that would almost always be the workflow, would be to pick a precinct that you would then, and so in general, and you're cutting a list, whether it be a precinct or some other sub-universe based on models or whatever it is, and then you're sort of sending it to the turf cutter. And like what I'll talk about in district analysis and planning, one of the things is like, how do we use counts and crosstabs to look at our universes and look at the distribution of our universes across our precincts and the density in different precincts, and sort of the idea being, okay, like how do we come up with what are the precincts we actually want to turf cut and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, you certainly raise like a great point. Like it would be great if we had sort of like GIS tools that displayed our data for us.
The key here though, if we had integrations, we could just do that.
Well,
We have the ability, right?
Well, and that actually does exist. So like there's a startup actually out of Seattle called like Empower Engine that basically that's their whole thing, is like trying to build a really cool field organizing GIS tool on top. What I always recommend to folks when you're cutting turf and doing this stuff though, just don't be scared to like pull in as many different resources as you can. Like there's a great website called like the US Statistical Atlas that has tons of great information. You know, if you really care about cutting turf and want your volunteers to have the best possible experience, like you'll be sitting there cutting turf with like Street View open, and you know you can spend cutting turf and doing this kind of stuff. There's like an art and a science to it for sure. And like Brad has been emphasizing, you know, you always want to be thinking about how you're apportioning your time. But you know, if you have volunteers or staffers who can be in charge of that, it's the experiences your volunteers have in the door are strongly shaped by the turf you cut, and your volunteers are really important. You want them to have good experiences.
So the minivan, I'm still learning. Cutting turf, I would just imagine that's just canvassing, or?
So when you say cutting turf, we're essentially, it is geographically divvying up a list, right? So like we have a list of the full precinct. We want our 20 volunteers to go out and canvass it. So it's a way of just literally drawing polygons on the map and saying, okay, these 25 doors are this person's and these are this person's.
And the literal routing is up to the individual. It's not like you're...
Yes, exactly. Although good turf cutting, if you're a good turf cutter, you're like thinking about that and like trying to create turfs that are work well for folks. Yeah, so you know, the canvassing webinar would be like a great one for you probably if you really want to get into the weeds on that. Like that's exactly, we'll be starting with West and cutting turf and all do that.
I said I definitely signed up for that.
Great. Well, I will talk to you in its end. Any other questions before I hand things back to Brad?
So one last thing about the minivan, that's just the web app.
It is the smartphone app,
Smartphone
specifically, yeah. And you can use it on tablets and stuff too, I believe. But yeah, it is a great way to be out in the field. Like from my perspective, once you've canvassed with minivan, it's very painful to go back to doing it any other way. It's like just holding your like lit and your phone is like a really good, and you can organize however you want. You can look at your folks on a map. You can do odd versus even, like sort of all. It allows very flexible.
Is there any kind of donation integration here? Like, as
So,
far as, like, what do you track? Is it just informational? Like they gave us money? Check?
so the van is not generally geared towards tracking donation information, right? It like doesn't have those functionalities, particularly because they wouldn't want to cannibalize their own business, probably to some extent, right? That being said, like
They're
when you
happening at the same times often.
right, exactly, and so like that type of data integration is like an omnipresent issue for campaigns, and like so we do when you get set up with your committee, you get a standard set of activist codes that include things like donor codes and stuff like that, so that you can try to sort of like normalize your database across your different things, but it's challenging.
Especially if you want to like cross correlate, they're like totally different
Right, and so one of the things is like we are sort of slowly moving towards a world of two databases, right? Like there's this sort of inherent need of a divide between our volunteers and the voter file. Like the voter file, like we talked about, is this shared resource. We have to sort of protect it against duplicates. We can't just let people like be adding people to it willy-nilly. On the other hand, we want you to be able to do that with your volunteers, right? Like if your 16-year-old kid neighbor is volunteering, there's no reason you can't have that person in your system. They just can't be on the voter file. So it's like right now we have those two sides, and then campaigns usually have like a third digital tool, fundraising tool, providing this other kind of stuff. And so for people like me, the like long-term dream is that like maybe these two, the volunteer one and the digital one and the contribution one, will eventually become one thing, and we are sort of slowly moving in that direction, but it's gonna be a while, unfortunately. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks folks. Yeah, feel free to email me after if you do have more.